Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating exploration of the bilingual, twice exceptional brain. So, have you ever tried communicating something deeply important to someone, only to be met with just a blank stare, or maybe a long lag, or even total silence? Naturally, we kind of jump to the conclusion that they're being cold, distant, or maybe just dismissive. But what if I told you there's actually an invisible, highly complex physical process happening right beneath the surface? Let's get into it.
If you've ever dealt with that frustrating silence when talking to a highly analytical partner or a colleague, you've probably wondered, is this emotional rejection? Well, looking at the science of cognitive geometry, it turns out it's actually a biological necessity. Seriously, it's not that they don't care about what you're saying, it's that their mental hardware is literally overloaded. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to cover the crowded cognitive space, the 2E masking trap, the system overflow error, ethical scaffolding, and we'll wrap up with a really practical communication toolkit.
Okay, starting off with Section 1, the crowded cognitive space, and understanding the bilingual brain's internal terrain.
So, researcher Christian Doehler has this amazing concept, revealing that our brains use a literal sat-nav system. Seriously, using specific neurons called grid and place cells, which act just like your brain's internal GPS coordinates. The brain geometrically maps out information into what we call cognitive spaces. You can think of it basically as a GPS for your thoughts. Memories and concepts actually have physical locations inside your mind. Now, unlike a standard open map with plenty of room to cruise around, a bilingual individual, let's just call him Tom, has a vastly crowded space. Why is that? Well, it's because Tom has multiple linguistic labels mapping onto the exact same conceptual coordinates. Imagine a single thought having multiple competing street signs. It makes the mental map incredibly dense, and honestly, a whole lot harder to navigate quickly. So here's the absolute crucial point. Shifting from a decoupled, highly logical environment, like say coding, over to high-fidelity emotional synthesis requires some massive computation. Their brain's sat-nav has to calculate a brand new trajectory while actively suppressing the competing language's vectors. Researchers call this orthogonal remapping friction. Basically, it's the mental gears grinding as the brain attempts a huge detour, and it takes real, physical calculation time. So those outward lags and silences we mentioned earlier, that's just the biological signature of intense structural sorting happening right there in their prefrontal cortex.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 2E masking trap, or the paradox of the twice exceptional mind.
You know, a brilliant professional mask can be incredibly deceiving. Let's take the example of a highly successful DeepMind AI researcher. In public, they present this highly capable, totally put-together facade, but this completely hides the underlying physiological constraints that pop up when that exact same person is faced with raw, unstructured human emotions. Their amazing cognitive flexibility in one highly structured area completely masks severe processing speed limits when it comes to navigating messy, unpredictable emotional data.
This brings us to Section 3, the system overflow error and the biological limits of visual working memory.
When you approach a heavily taxed prefrontal cortex with uninsulated emotional content, something pretty dramatic happens. Their visual working memory capacity, which is essentially the brain's RAM, drops to an inflexible bottleneck of literally just 1 to 2 items. Yes, you heard that right, just 1 or 2 items. Imagine trying to process a nuanced, multi-layered emotional conversation when your brain can physically only hold a single piece of data at a time. I mean, it's pretty much an impossible task.
Let's break down exactly how this crash happens. The sudden emotional load essentially triggers a system overflow error. First, the emotional data gets introduced, but because the prefrontal cortex is already completely exhausted from all that bilingual suppression we talked about, bioenergetic channels in the brain, specifically the KIR 6.2 channels, just slam open. This hyperpolarizes the membrane. It acts exactly like an electrical circuit breaker flipping off. It forces a protective, silent freeze to prevent a complete systemic collapse. So no, they really aren't ignoring you. Their biological system has literally pulled the emergency brake just to survive.
Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, translation as ethical scaffolding and bridging the gap with structured language.
So, the reality is, you just cannot rely on their overloaded brain to automatically decode your nuance. It's simply not fair or honestly even physically possible for them in that moment. Instead, you've got to use translation as your optical cable. This actually draws on the philosophies of thinkers like Gadamer and Recor. They argued that it's really our responsibility to bridge that gap of understanding and to deliver messages through a medium the other person can actually process.
Practically, this means taking your complex human truths and packaging them into the highly structured native languages they already process super efficiently. If they're a brilliant AI researcher or an engineer, you have to speak their language. Frame your emotional needs using their daily metaphors, whether that's commutative algebra, quantum mechanics, or metabolic coupling. By doing this, you're bypassing their bilingual remapping friction entirely. You're essentially formatting the data so their system can accept it without crashing.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, the Communication Toolkit, filled with practical strategies for perceptual rescue.
To successfully bypass all that cognitive friction and prevent the biological freeze, you can employ 3 specific science-backed hermeneutic translation solutions to deliver your message safely. We've got sequential gating, perceptual rescue, and data compression. Let's look at exactly how you can use each one of these.
The first tool is sequential gating, specifically using the PrEP framework. This is based on the Vogel Lab's discovery that sequential presentation dramatically reduces memory competition. So you want to deliver your concepts linearly. By using this exact PrEP trajectory, which stands for point, reason, example, point, you're giving them one bite-sized piece at a time. This completely prevents their working memory from overflowing and provides a really clean, safe retrieval queue for their central executive.
Next up, you can perform what's literally called a perceptual rescue of your signal. Remember earlier how we said their visual working memory drops to just 1 or 2 items? Well, you can actually hack this. You do it by pairing your deep emotional needs with highly structured, predictable visual and spatial models. Draw diagrams, use 3D sandbox simulations, or, hey, even grab some Legos to playfully but practically map out roles and serious relationship dynamics. You are basically handing their brain a structured spatial map to help it process all that unstructured emotional data.
Finally, we have data compression. Drawing on Paul Bay's 2024 research, we know the adult brain optimizes its super-limited working memory by using existing schemas or mental blueprints. So if you wrap your emotional truth inside a structural blueprint they already deeply understand, their central executive can compress all those complex emotional connections into a single metabolically safe chunk. Basically, you're doing the grueling prefrontal sorting for them, delivering a perfectly packaged concept they can instantly grasp.
By doing this translation work, you completely bypass their cognitive friction. You stand on equal intellectual footing, offering their capacity-constrained mind a truly safe pathway to connect. And that leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought to consider. What if you framed your shared cognitive constraints and your next communication hurdle not as a painful personal rejection, but simply as a collaborative engineering problem waiting to be solved? Just think about how that shift in perspective could completely transform things. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time as we unpack another fascinating concept.